We will start our third plenary session of the conference titled First as Tragedy Than as Farce, English in Early and Late Colonial Bangladesh. Our plenary speaker is Professor Salimul Khan from General Education Department, University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. He is also the director of Center for Advanced Theory at ULAB. He holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research, New York, and a Master of Law from University of Dhaka. He has more than 27 years of teaching experience at public and private universities, as well as several colleges in the USA, including the State University of New York at Purchase and the City University of New York. Professor Khan is a well-known historian, political critic, and public intellectual. He has authored and edited a number of books in Bangla and English, including Adam Boma, Ahmed Sofa Sanjibuni, Behad Biplab, Goriber Rabindranath, and Silence. Professor Khan has translated the works of Abdur Razak, Lalon Shah, Joshimuddin, Begum Rokeya into English, and Plato, James, Ranulph, Charles Baudelaire into Bengal. Currently, he is the editor of Apostrophe, Working Papers of the Center for Advanced Theory, and Occasional Papers in Theory. I would now request Professor Salimullah Khan to begin his plenary session, please.
Let me begin by showing what I'm going to speak about. But before I really begin, let me say a few words of thanks for ULAB, the organizers of this conference, and especially to Professor Shaila Sultana. I'm grateful for inviting someone outside in the teaching machine to participate in your program. So I will begin right away. The real topic is the introduction of English language in early colonial Bangladesh or Bengal, and its continuation today and the metamorphosis. I would like to just begin with a warning that I'm not going to make an essay which may be called historical. I only borrow certain facts from history to explain something which might be called sociological. I think with that caveat, I can begin. So here I begin with the well-known remark of Karl Marx. By the way, I divide my presentation into three sections. One is the experience of colonialism in the 19th century, which is very well known and well studied. And the other one is experience of colonialism today, about which we have many prefixes: neo-colonialism, post-colonialism, or nothing but simply, as we say, sometimes called imperialism. And at the end, I will make a remark about what is the sociological condition of the results of these two colonial phases. One can be called the classical colonial phase, and this present one, which is a moot point, I would say, is a new colonial point. So here is the famous speech by Karl Marx at the beginning of his booklet, published in 1852. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Hegel remarks somewhere that all the great events and characters of world history occur, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. What I'm going to argue in brief is that if the introduction of English in the 19th century can be viewed as a tragedy, then what is going on now may be called a farce. Or if you find this term too harsh, let's call it a comedy. So I will begin with the experience of Michael Madhusudan Datta as an example. I will give you only a few case studies instead of making a long survey. I borrow this from the poet, well-known poet, Vishnu De. In 1958, in an essay on Michael Madhusudan Datta, Vishnu De, who is a poet in his own right, says this: the tragedy of Michael Madhusudan Datta has a symbolic quality. It is the tragedy of false promises in the history of Anglo-India. Michael started to write in his mother tongue a year after the Great Revolt of 1857. Michael had realized, and quite early in our modern period, the futility of our Anglo-Renaissance, and had regretted his homeless wanderings across fanciful foreign seas and in alien ports. So I continue the narrative of Vishnu De with occasional remarks. There is hardly any originality to expect from my presentation. Ever since the 19th century, at least for a century or so, the wide world in horizon, however limited or lopsided our knowledge of that world has been and perhaps still is, Vishnu De once wrote, as I said in 1958, the year I was born, our vision of Europe or of the modern world has been determined not by our own organic needs and their fulfillment, but by our English masters from the depriving point of view of their own parasitic needs. I mean, it's well known now, Gauri Vishwanathan's thesis, Masks of Conquest, it simply anticipates that. The organic needs of nations include the development of their languages and literatures, even in accordance with the most minimalist account. The wind from Europe, despite the considerable help in the development of our meager literature, as they has it, also served as a somewhat retarding force, which is not often noted. This is my main point of argument, that we always see the contribution of our European connections to the Bengal Renaissance of the 19th century. But I think the somewhat retarding force, I quote this term from Vishnu De, has not been properly emphasized. And this is, I would say, paradigmatically symbolized by the experience of Madhusudan Datta. But before that, I say, it was not only a mask of conquest that the English imposed English on us. From what point of view the enlightened Bengalis or Indians who welcomed English needs to be understood well. I will cite the well-known letter written by Raja Rammohun Rai to the English Governor General then, whose name was Lord Amherst, in 1823. I will just take a leaf from Rammohun's letter written to Amherst, which is submitted through Bishop Reginald Heber. It is part of that letter towards the end. If it had been intended to keep the British nation in ignorance of the real knowledge of Baconian philosophy, would not have been allowed to displace the system of the schoolman, which was the best calculated to perpetuate ignorance. So, in the same manner, the Sanskrit system of education would be the best calculated to keep the country in darkness, if such had been the policy of the British legislature. Rammohun continues, but as the improvement of the native population, nowadays we use the term development, but in the 19th century, until the 1930s, this was the key term, improvement. As the improvement of the native population is the object of the government, it will consequently promote a more liberal and enlightened system of instruction, embracing, you note this, mathematics, natural philosophy, nowadays called physics, chemistry, and anatomy, nowadays called more or less biology, with other useful sciences which may be accomplished with the sum was only 1 lakh rupees per year, proposed by employing a few gentlemen of talents and learning educated in Europe, and providing a college furnished with the necessary books, instruments, and other apparatus. I tried to maintain the capitalization as Rammohun did in his letters. So here is the question. Employing a few gentlemen of talents and learning educated in Europe and providing a college. This is in the 6th year of the foundation of the then Hindu college. So now the point I promised is this. How did colonialism work as a retarding force? It can only be manifested when we compare. It's not a counterfactual. It's saying what was its factual influence on the language and literature of the people they colonized. Even to this day also, I will insist on using this standard of judgment. And if you agree to use this standard of judgment, I will say today, Bengali literature in its entire history of about 1,000 years is passing through the darkest period from 1971 to today. That's an argument I will go to support later. Towering figures of Bengali literature from Rammohun Rai to Rabindranath Tagore. This is what Vishnu the main mentioned, but I would like to add from Mir Musharraf Hussain to Kazi Nazrul Islam, worked under the shadow of Anglo-European literatures. The great men of our literature had to be aware of their own past, as of the wind from Europe. Here you can recall Vidyasagar and other stalwarts who learned as much as they could from Europe, but did not give in their own culture. Our fathers and grandfathers, Vishnu reminds us, had still something of an unsplit sensibility, some uniformity of good taste. However precarious the minority poets might have been, working quite heroically, they succeeded to an astonishing extent in creating the modern part of our literature. So, what was the false trail? Reasoning by analogy, we all know that. Rabindranath Tagore was called the Shelley of Bengal, Bankim was a Scot, Michael was Milton, etc. But this happy fact in no way justifies the habit of academic persons to think of our literature and even its towering figures in analogy with those of English literature. To call Bankim R. Scott or Michael R. Milton explains nothing. As a matter of fact, this lazy proneness to analogy is not restricted in our country to literature or artwork alone. It is a part of our whole attitude to ourselves, to our own history, and the tempting shortcut that has led us to no real understanding and solution of our diverse problems. So Madhusudan's example may serve to substantiate what I'm trying to argue. Born in 1824, the same year which saw the birth of the Hindu patriot Harish Chandra Mukherjee, Michael was a spoiled son, as everyone knows. Thanks, however, to his mother, the boy Michael had grown quite familiar with the usual volumes of Bengali verse. A fact which is of significance in any explanation whatsoever of the later phenomenon of his own Bengali verse. Some people wonder how come all of a sudden he comes from Madras and writes so excellent verse and plays in Bengali. There is something like iceberg under the water. Like many members of the new gentry in Bengal of those days, he wanted to follow and live up to this analogy, and that even when he was a quite young boy. But the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and Kavi Kankan Chandi were hard to shed off. As a matter of fact, the peculiar nature of Michael's genius may be said to have flourished on and through this split, the division which was at the back of the whole of our Indo-Anglian period, socially, politically, and psychologically. So this is, I take this from one's letter, Madhusudan's letter. He picked up with age Sanskrit, Persian, Latin, Greek, you say classical languages, English, French, German, Italian, modern languages, not to mention Bengali. But in the depths of his consciousness, Bengali had her submarine hold. These terms I take from Vishnu. That is why the absurd Anglo-Indian from Madras had to write his first notable play and his first readable poem in Bengali. Michael wanted to be an Englishman, as everybody knows, but it did not pay. But surely that cannot be the sole reason. Michael had the poet in him, and he came to find out that however finely one can speak and write letters in English, and Vishnu remarks, and my dear fellow, as he would have said, he wrote real good letters in amazingly good English. One cannot write poetry in an alien language, with apology to our poets who are trying to write in English. The most unnatural imposition on a whole people, and we tend to forget this. Educated in Hindu college with remarkable teachers like Richardson, Michael went along on his primrose path to Europe. It was unnatural, no doubt, but it was unnatural in the midst of the most unnatural imposition on a whole people. We constantly tend to forget this fact of conquest. As a matter of fact, there is a whole hogger logicality in Michael's Anglification of himself. Most of our pioneers in Bengal at that time had given away their soul to Albion. Even Michael also sighed for Albion's disease of the native home and social life. There were very few exceptions among our intellectuals, forerunners like Vidyasagar, who did not allow violence to his inner being, who intellectually faced Europe and was rightly fascinated by her humanism, and not by the glamour, which need not be taken as a necessary concomitant of the mad through superficial rush of the English bourgeoisie. The reason Raja Ram Mohan Rai welcomed English learning was for, never forget, mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and such other sciences. And these were denied throughout the 19th century. People, those who write the history of Renaissance, tend to completely forget this. Now, Michael's genius. How could this outsider get in touch with the very genius of the language? It is true, his vocabulary was poor. He had to ask for the choice of synonyms, the help of his pandits. He had many gaps in his semantics, but he did have a marvelous sense of the speech rhythm and a hang of the idiom of the language. That Michael revealed lapses in his unnatural and too quickly acquired education in Bengali is not the remarkable thing about him. What is remarkable is his uncanny sureness about the sound and movement of Bengali speech rhythm and the raciness of his idiom, in spite of his at times cumbrous Sanskritism. So I'm going to finish this section. This self-certainty or sureness helped Michael overcome his Firingi youth in Calcutta and Madras. He started with an innate sense of language and had enough of the European in him to know what was essential in verse. And he had wonderful good taste. After all, he was a provincial in an empire of a people with all the limitations of insularity, with all the vices of a worldwide mercantile military domination. So the outcome, Michael's poetry was really popular. I will just jump over this. Those who could appreciate Michael's poetry included not only a handful of Hindu college babus or Paikpara jamindars and their friends, the Banyan's assistants also could enjoy his verse. So did China Bazaar shopkeepers, and so on and so forth. So he's a genius, there is no doubt, but he had been often misunderstood, not the least by our Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath could never make a distinction between Hemchandra Bandyopadhyay and Michael. Everybody knows it. He was widely misunderstood. But finally, I would say, even Rajnarayan Mitra, it is taken from a letter by Michael himself. Or think of R, most probably that prodigious scholar, critic, editor, historian, and whatnot. Rajendra Lal was 2 years senior to Michael, by the way. Rajendra Lal Mitra, about whom Michael was compelled to write. He reads Byron, Scott, and Moore. Very nice poets in their way, no doubt, but by no means of the highest school of poetry, except perhaps Byron. Now and then, I like Wordsworth better. I cite this only to say that Michael's sense was absolutely, I would say, right. In his literary taste also, he was a great thinker, I would say this. So now, false analogy is unmasked, and he discovers a hole in the center. The center cannot hold. Michael had learned his lesson in Calcutta and Madras, as we know, in London and in Versailles, as Wordsworth did differently when England declared war against the French Revolution. He found the hollowness, the bitter hollowness of Indo-Anglian Renaissance. And luckily for him, though he could not repair his personal life, he could release himself as a poet, qua poet. No wonder that he hated in his rage Rama and his rebel. With his deep strength of a man of song and his nerves used to speech and poetry of Bengal, he did bring about a sort of tortured renaissance in India's poetry. So with this, I will go to the second section, where what is happening in Bangladesh today. I again take shelter or use as a shield a great intellectual everyone respects but nobody listens to, is Badruddin Umar. In 1998, in an article published in Economic and Political Weekly in Bombay, he says this. The name of his essay is very interesting. He calls it The Anti-Heroes of the Language Movement. I just copied verbatim. In Bangladesh today, you come to see that the ruling class neglects its own mother tongue more widely than it used to be the case in the Pakistan days. This is the outcome, according to Badruddin Umar. The present educational system is clearly divided broadly into two systems on the basis of medium of instruction. One for the generally lower income groups and the other for the higher income groups. The latter, higher income groups, by virtue of their better education, get far better opportunities in their post-educational career. That is, of course, obvious. So Umar continues. A principal objective of the language movement, 47 to 52, was fulfilled. Remember, for those who does not need to be reminded, let me reiterate, Omar is the premier historian of the language movement, was fulfilled when, along with Urdu, Bengali was declared a state language of Pakistan in 1956. To function as a state language, it was also necessary to develop Bengali as a medium of instruction, as well as a language of education, science, and culture. This will remind you of Rammohn Roy's hopes. After being declared a state language, the development of the Bengali language soon became a matter of no concern for the Bengali bourgeoisie, even under Pakistan. Since 1971, it is a sordid story. They began to act as the anti-heroes of the language movement, continuing at the same time to glorify their heroic acts in the 1952 language movement and singing litanies of the great sacrifices they made. Therefore, a serious dichotomy in the system of instruction has already emerged. A great class difference has been created. I don't say that it is caused by English, but English is a correlation relative here. Books in Bengali were missing, and on account of poverty in English, also books in English remain beyond the reach of students at large. In other words, a serious dichotomy was created in the system of instruction, resulting in continuous lowering of the standard in post-liberation Bangladesh. For promoting education, establishing a Bureau of Translation and undertaking the work of translating scientific literature, literary, philosophical, and other classics, reference books, and all sorts of necessary reading and research materials from foreign languages into Bengali was really important. Nothing was actually done in that direction, and the education system was left thus unattended. These are facts I think no one will dispute. But what is the meaning of it? The deep-rooted causes of this silence on the development of Bengali and of the entire education system for that matter have to be sought in the character of the ruling classes since the expulsion of Pakistan. This class of people came to acquire an unheard of magnitude of wealth, primarily through primitive methods of accumulation, plunder, robbery, corruption, and terrorism. I just paraphrase this from Badruddin Umar's article, but I sometimes quote him direct. This class's culture would logically be in harmony with the ways of acquiring this wealth, like this. However, Omar continues, they neglect general education system, instruction in Bengali medium schools, colleges and universities, which concern the great masses of students, the children of the exploited and victimized classes. We have a little bit of exposure to this because we take 67% of our intake is from Bengali medium schools. After all, more than that. So the character of the ruling classes become manifest here. This does not mean that they neglect the education of their own children. Far from it. You know it. They provide much better education for their children through model schools, cadet colleges, and externally oriented schools, nowadays kindergartens, where teaching English is done seriously and the level of instruction is of a much higher grade. And they go to, other countries. I will skip this because of lack of time. So let me come to our third and last person. Colonialism, I see it as perversion. Franz Fanon famously says it is neurosis. I beg leave of departing from him. And there is a reason why I say so. I will try to explain it. Apart from a few hiccups that occurred in a closed environment, Fanon writes this in his Black Skin and White Mask, chapter 6, Psychopathology and the Negro. Apart from a few hiccups that occurred in a closed environment, any neurosis, any abnormal behavior or affective erotism is in an Antillean, that is Caribbean, is the result of his cultural situation. Fanon continues. In other words, a host of information and a series of propositions slowly and stealthily work their way into an individual through books, newspapers, school texts, advertisements, again, movies, and I should not have repeated this. Sorry about that. And movies and also radio and shape his community's vision of the world. These are common knowledge for all of us, but I just say this to reiterate what I'm trying to do. Language is a logical starting point for a psychoanalytic examination of the problems of colonialism because of the critical role language has historically played and continues to play today in the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Historically, serious symptoms of neurosis are related to the alienation experienced by colonized individuals. We know it. If you go to Europe and America, you suffer from it. An alienation determined by a botched process of cultural assimilation. And education is the primary field of colonization policies. Education may provide a most fertile field of analysis. As I'm running out of time, let me pass on quickly. Next point is, in the Antilles, just one example. That means in the Caribbean region, that is, as they say it in French, in the Antilles, the black schoolboy who is constantly asked to recite our ancestors, the Gauls, identifies himself with the explorer, the civilizing colonizer, the white man who brings truth to savages, a lily white truth. The identification process means that the black child subjectively adopts a white man's attitude. Please don't forget that this was written in 1952. He invests the hero, who is white, with all his aggressiveness, which at this age closely resembles self-sacrifice, a self-sacrifice loaded with sadism. Now, Fano inadvertently agrees with me here. Sadism is an aspect of perversion, not neurosis. Because I do a little bit of psychoanalysis, probably this is my little bit of a contribution here. An 8-year-old child who is giving something, even to an adult, cannot tolerate a refusal. Gradually, an attitude, a way of thinking and seeing that is basically white, forms and crystallizes in the young Antillean. So I will now read you a few lines before I conclude from a poem by Leon Gontran Damas. You know him. He is the first poet of the so-called Negritude movement, born in 1912. He's one senior by 1 year to M.A. César. So this poem shows what is called intellectual alienation. And in vain, the name of the poem is the hiccups, in French, okay. And in vain I swallow 7 gulps of water, 3 to 4 times a day. My childhood returns to me in a shaking hiccup. My instinct, like the cop, the thug, disaster. Tell me about the disaster. Tell me about it. My mother wanting a son with good table manners. Hands on the table. Bread is not cut. Bread is broken. Bread is not wasted. Bread of God. Bread of the sweat of your father's brow. Bread of bread. A bone is eaten deliberately and discreetly. A stomach should be polite, and no polite stomach burps. A fork is not a toothpick. Do not blow your nose openly in public and then sit up straight. A well-brought-up nose does not wipe a plate clean. And then, in the name of the Father, of the Son, of the Holy Ghost, at the end of every meal, and then, disaster. Tell me about the disaster. Tell me about it. My mother wanting a noteworthy son. If you do not learn your history lesson, you will not go to Mass. Sunday in your Sunday best. This child will be the disgrace of our name. This child will be our in the name of God. Shut up. Did I? Or did I not tell you that? You must speak French. The French of France, the French of the French, the French. Disaster. Tell me about the disaster. Tell me about it. By the way, Dama is a Guyanese, and Franz Fanon in Black Skin and White Mask in the first chapter quotes this. That's why I have given you the whole poem. My mother wanting a son, his mother's son, you did not greet the neighbor. You dirty shoes again. And do not let me catch you in the street and on the grass of the savannah. In the grass of the savannah, in the shadow of the war memorial, playing, hanging out with so-and-so who was never baptized. So I'm almost finished. Disaster. Tell me about the disaster. Tell me about it. My mother wanting a son, very do, very re, very me, very fa, very sol, very la, very si, very do, very re mi fa, sol la si do. I hear that once again. You did not go to your violin lesson, a banjo. Did you say banjo? What did you say? Banjo? You really said a banjo? No, sir. You must learn that we do not allow in our home. Neither ban, nor jo, nor gi, nor tar. The mulattoes do not do that. Leave it to the neg. This is a peculiar term used in the Caribbean between Negro and the black. So I'm now finally in the right moment at the end of my last, what you call, slide. Let me finish with this. A disgrace for mankind. This is my conclusion. Fano says, on this subject, I shall remark on something I have found in many writers. Intellectual alienation is a creation of bourgeois society. And for me, bourgeois society is any society that becomes ossified in a predetermined mold. stifling any development, progress, or discovery. For me, bourgeois society is a closed society. Lord, my goodness. Is a closed society where it is not good to be alive, where the air is rotten and ideas and people are putrefying, and that a man who takes a stand against this living death is in a way a revolutionary. So my conclusion is these 3 lines. I should add that what Fanon calls intellectual alienation makes good stuff for Farce, the colonizer's love. And for the colonized perhaps knows not that this decomposition is an avatar of perversion, a disgrace for mankind. Thank you all.